So, what I wanted to do first today is just kind of check in on how it's going with the lojong practice. So, if I recall correctly, last week um, I recommended reading, sort of sitting with these verses we've done so far. We've gone through verse 3, um, and just sitting with what comes up for you and seeing how to relate to your experience in relation to these verses. Of course, like when we're reciting or reflecting on a verse, we're also thinking of the meaning. But what I was urging was first working with our response to that meaning, so then we can access that meaning in in a more meaningful way, for lack of a better way to say it. So yeah, I just wanted to open it up for a few minutes if anyone has anything to share from your experience working with these verses, and or just anything we talked about in the last two sessions, because we did talk a lot about working with coming home into the body, working with our emotional responses and things like that. So you're welcome to, I think you can unmute yourself.
Uh, Hi, Scott.
Hey.
I'll just say that it's really interesting how with stress, with deadlines, with any of this angst, anxiety, it's really easy to leave the body. And that separation of mind body just doesn't allow me to calm down and access really what's going on. So if I can manage at those times just to grab the breath, concentrate on the breath, I go back into the body, then I can actually, do the practices off the cushion as well. So I just it's just interesting.
Wonderful. Good reflections. Yeah. Can't see anyone's hands, so I don't know if anyone's reaching for that mute button or not. It doesn't look like it. Yeah, you don't have to say something. Just wanted to leave some moments for that. Mary bravely kicked us off. Yeah, I see those muscles there. Okay. So feel free at the end, we'll open up for Q&A if you want to share anything that comes up. So today what I'd like to focus on is sort of a brief recap of verse 3, because we dug into that, not a recap, but actually adding to it some commentary. We kind of closed on verse 3, and yeah, I thought to start there. And this also relates to something I'd like to share in the last week that I'm working with too. So verse 3 again is like this. It says, "In all actions I shall examine my mind, and the moment an unsubdued thought arises, endangering myself and others, I shall face and avert it." So again, I'd be curious if you've been working with this verse, because again, these are meant to be actionable. What's kind of been coming up for you? But for me, this is, of course, like an ongoing part of my Buddhist practice for many years, of sort of working with what we call our kleshas, right? Which is for us, beginners and intermediate practitioners, until we've stabilized an experience of emptiness. We're having to counteract and work with our destructive emotions or our kleshas, by applying antidotes, by training in lojong, by training in bodhicitta, by training in emptiness. And these are all the ways we work with it, including our ethical structures, like our vows that we've committed to. Those form a way to do this too. So what I wanted to focus on around here is just sort of a few approaches. So we have, what can be called a Shravakayana approach, meaning an approach in the systems of the lower and medium scopes of the Lamarim, and in the Gelug tradition, and what we would say sort of some people might say, okay, relates more to the Theravada tradition of what's in current existence, closest to the Shravakayana approach, though I don't think they're exactly the same. Tibetan Buddhism tends to frame Buddhism in what's called a three-vehicle approach, or a three-yana approach, right? Where we have the Shravakayana, the teachings coming from the Pali Canon that are in common with that, the Mahayana, and then the Vajrayana as an extension of the Mahayana. And we often in Tibetan Buddhism, we're intersecting these. These are kind of interweaving and interwoven in our practice as we're developing our insight and reflection and learning into these three vehicles. So this verse is really referring to a first vehicle approach, really working with the mind, working with our destructive emotions, through averting them, through facing and then applying an antidote. So averting here means applying some kind of antidote to counter the destructive emotion. I told you I'd talk a little bit about my experience, which is, I've struggled a lot with that. I mean, as I'm sure you have too. It's not easy to apply antidotes. But what I wanted to be specific about is I've struggled a lot with this, where, going back to our previous talks, our previous Saturdays, where sometimes when over the years, I'm talking over 20 years, it's changed for me now. But I remember, 10 or so years ago, applying an antidote also kind of could add to a sense of diminishment of myself at the same time. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but again, it kind of relates to these topics that I've already, scaffolded or brought into context the last two Saturdays. So if someone's listening to the recording and you're not sure what I'm talking about, you may have to go back and listen. But it's this idea that how do we use Dharma in our cultural context, where a lot of us do suffer from a lack of confidence and self-confidence. A lot of us do suffer, as I've pointed out, through the disembodiment, not knowing how to be in the body and relate to uncomfort and uncomfortable emotions. And for me, part of this was when applying an antidote, it works. It's not that it doesn't work, but also it can be a bypass of my emotional experience. So, a very this term has become popularized in the last 10 years. I knew John Wellwood, who's a Western psychologist and I think Dharma practitioner as well. He coined this term spiritual bypassing, which has become quite popular. And again, I don't have a lot to say about spiritual bypassing. He has a whole book on it, and lots of people have been commenting on it and have their ideas of what that means. To me, it means when I'm using a spiritual practice to sort of bypass part of my reality, right? And I'm not acknowledging that reality, embodying it, and or able to work with it because I'm just using some technique or phrase or idea to not deal with the real issue. To me, that's what spiritual bypassing really is. And of course, we can get into a conversation of what real issue. It could be many real issues. It could be working with an emotion, working with the uncomfort in our body, the stress. It could be, a lot of people are connecting spiritual bypassing into anti-racist work. So it could be sort of shirking our responsibility of how our body shows up in the world in a racialized society. So it could be all of these kinds of things. But for me, applying an antidote, like I said, again, I don't want to say it and create a black and white thing around this, because sometimes I apply an antidote over the years and it's fine. And it's just sort of like, okay, yeah, that's great. Like I'm being patient now and the anger has time to subside, right? But I've noticed sometimes I'm applying patience while sort of demonizing myself. So this is sort of where, I again, I don't want to bring too much psychology into it, but Western psychology, but there's this kind of idea, I think, where we can go outwards in our anger, like take anger as a destructive emotion, right? Where, this verse is definitely referring, an unsubdued thought would be anger, right? That could be a possibility. So anger can go outwards, right? Or it can go back inwards. And to me, I guess from a Buddhist framework. It's a little bit better if it goes inwards in a sense, but it's kind of not, because we're still a sentient being, you know. And I think sometimes when we read these things, there's this notion that, okay, it's all about how we're working with others, and then we deny and diminish ourselves through this. And to me, that's not workable, because the whole point of this is to awaken for the benefit of all sentient beings. And how are we supposed to awaken if we don't like ourselves? I just don't see that as a possibility. You know, you see this actually in the life stories of Tibetan saints. I don't think it's a new cultural issue, but like, for instance, Milarepa, this is a large part of the hagiography of Milarepa, where he you know, murdered a bunch of people, and you know, felt the impact of that, and you know, of course, felt he was the worst person in the world. He had like done the worst thing, which he did something really awful, right? But he diminished himself to the point that, like, it wasn't the act that he was struggling, you know, struggling with the act, but also struggling with his fundamental confidence in himself. And then, of course, he sought the Dharma as a remedy to that. And then we know the rest of the story, how he became enlightened. Well, some of us, if we read it, he became enlightened in one lifetime. But I think part of that process, as you can see, was a process of fearlessness that he developed towards himself through Dharma practice. And I don't think that could have happened if in the stages of his practice, he regained some confidence. We also know in that story that the confidence for him, part of it being regained, was actually like this interplay with Marpa, his teacher, his guru, which again, I think that kind of guru-disciple relationship, I'm not sure if it would work in the modern world. You know, Marpa would have probably been Me Too'd and thrown in jail, you know, pretty close to the beginning of his career. But either way, I'm joking. So he would have, you know, again, the point being, if we can look at it as an analogy, you know, Marpa really was really intense with Milarepa, to say the least, and hard on him. And in that cultural context, again, I'm not judging it from our perspective now. I'm going to try to look at it from, you know, this was what, 12 or 1300, something like that, right before Tsongkhapa. So yeah. So anyways, so in that process, you know, it looks like Milarepa was able to work with the diminishment of himself through sort of the teacher pointing out, being hard on him. He was able to gain some self-respect, right? And so, and then of course that self-respect continued as he began to embody the Mahayana teachings, bodhicitta, as well as emptiness. So again, just to point that out, I think this is something to look for us. I don't think it's just pointing out it's not a modern world problem only, but I think it's become a little bit more rampant than maybe it was in Milarepa's day. I mean, Milarepa really had an extreme life, so we could see how he could experience that. So an unsubdued thought, again, refers to any of the kleshas coming out of craving, aversion, or ignorance, right? We have the 5 main kleshas: craving, aversion, ignorance, pride, and jealousy, right? And then these 5 kind of branch off into the 84,000 delusions. Yeah, so supposedly there's 84,000. I don't think they mean descript, like I guess it can get specific, but it's sort of like the flavors of jealousy and how those can function, the layers of it. Like we can even see with aversion. I can probably find at least 5 or 10 types of aversion within myself at this point, like within my experience, which is, you know, subtle sort of, you know, angst, like just a little ruffled, to annoyed at someone, right? Sometimes I become resistant towards something. That's also a form of aversion or anger. So when we use awareness to uncover our mind, right, which is what I was talking about in the guided meditation a little bit, we see these things. We see the layers of anger. We see the layers of craving. And what we see is the mind is always doing it. The samsaric mind, the habitual mind, is always trying to bring something close and push something away. This is all craving and aversion. And so I think when when I began to see it that way, just describing my experience to share with you, because again, I can say this is how the tradition says it and all that, but sometimes I find it more useful to talk from personal experience. Um, when I see that, when I began to see that, it makes it real, right? I'm sure some of you can relate to this. It makes the Dharma applicable. It makes it real, and it doesn't make it a punishment, right? Because we have to come to the conclusion, craving and aversion, what the verse says here, unsubdued thought, jealousy, pride, ignorance, these are harming us. Yes, they harm others, right? Like when we act out of anger, we harm others, but they're harming us. Not just, we could talk about karmically and all that, and how it conditions our behavior in the future and creates suffering for the future, but just in the moment when I'm in a mind of craving, I don't feel settled. I don't feel at ease. I don't feel content. I feel stirred up. When I'm in a mind of anger, which is easier to see than craving, I'm definitely stirred up, right? I'm definitely struggling. I'm definitely finding it hard to just be in my body. so this is, I think, when we take this approach, excuse me, when we take this approach with our unsubdued thoughts and kleshas, it becomes a kind of a beautiful kind of practice of like an archaeological dig of curiosity, rather than self-diminishment and self-hate, right, or dislike of self, or however you want to frame it. So then when we use the sort of methods from the lower and medium scope Lama Rim, which I'm just putting them under the category of Shravakayana, basically the practice of a Shravaka. Then when we work with them, we can do them a little more happily. We can do them with a notion of, okay, this is something that's harming me. And for me, if I recognize it as something harmful, it's easy to apply an antidote, because it's like, okay, this is harmful, right? And so some of these antidotes might look something like this. So the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, suggests, which these come from the sutras, for attachment, we meditate on sort of, they sometimes say ugliness, but what this really means is like we meditate, or we reflect on the downsides of something, right? So if I really have a strong craving or attachment for coffee, meditating on sort of not just the good things about the coffee, but the things that are, the other side of the coffee, because everything, yeah, exactly, me too. I'm actually drinking ginger, but I got coffee over there. To me, it was easy. The coffee was too bitter today, so I just couldn't finish it. Just black without sugar. So, if we're trying to work with our craving for that, then we work with the downsides. So again, like for me, coffee kind of makes me a little agitated. It makes me a little more anxious, but I love the taste, right? So there's the craving for the taste, but the other side of it. So typically when they say the word ugliness, this was used, again, when we're talking about Shravakayana approaches, they were approaches for monastics mostly. But of course, as householder practitioners, we also need to apply them to work with our craving. But they would meditate on not just the beautiful aspects of one's own body or the body of another, but also the aspects that aren't so pleasing, right? And so this is where there's a lot of meditation for Buddhist monastics, both women and men, to work with that. So then the classic antidote to anger is love, meditating on love, right? So we would first notice the anger in our being, the aversion, the resistance, sit with that in the body, be quite clear how it's harming, how it's creating destruction for ourselves and others. And then we move in with this antidote of love, right? This heart that is cultivating care and warmth towards ourselves and others. And this can also become an antidote for that self-harm, like if we tend to turn the anger back on ourselves, which can happen, where I've gone through periods where I'm just angry, I'm angry. Have you ever experienced that before? I'm especially as Buddhists, because we're not supposed to be angry, right? Shh, don't get angry. Smile all the time, right? Like, so I think in Tibetan Buddhism, we don't have this so much because we see lamas and figures we respect, teachers who display the range of emotion. I think one example is often people will get very sentimental around His Holiness Dalai Lama, and like, he also like gets rough sometimes, he's not smiling all the time if you really get to know him. And that doesn't diminish his bodhisattva ness. Like, and I think this is kind of sometimes where then we can diminish ourselves, because we might think, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I can't, experience anger. But what's it like to experience anger, not throw it out, not throw it on oneself, but simply offer love as an antidote to it? That's kind of what we're doing here. Then for closed-minded ignorance, we meditate on dependent arising, right? So dependent origination. And dependent arising is this aspect of reality where nothing stands alone, nothing sits in relationship only to itself. Everything's always in relationship to another part, another piece, another human, another thought, another emotion, another perception, whatever it is. And so we can meditate on, if we're experiencing sort of stuckness in our mind, ignorance towards something, we meditate on the dependent origination of it. And then in general, if we're having a lot of disturbing thoughts, just like everything's tossed up like a whirlwind or a hurricane in the mind, they say to meditate on the breath and the energy winds. So His Holiness did, in the commentary to these 8 verses, he did bring up this topic of the energy winds, which is typically more of a Vajrayana topic. So this is what I find so interesting in Himalayan Buddhism, is actually we can talk about the 3 vehicles separately, like Shravakyana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, or Suchayana and Vajrayana, as 2 approaches. But often they're bringing in Vajrayana anyways in the beginning. Like the energy winds are Vajrayana perspective of the subtle body, the lung within the body, lung meaning lung being the Tibetan for prana. And this is a subtle energy wind. It's not something we're going to find with a microscope. But what we can do through breath practices and certain pranayama practices, we can allow those winds to settle. And this is a big part of working with the body too. It just isn't the focus of this course. That's why I didn't teach them. But I find working with being in the body and doing pranayama practices to settle the energy winds to be very, very complementary practices that I highly recommend. So in a way, that last one can be the first one, meaning like whether we're experiencing anger, craving, or ignorance or jealousy or pride, we can work with settling the energy winds. So what the energy winds do when they're exacerbated, there's actually 5 types of, I'm going to go into a little bit here. There's 5 types of main energy winds in the body, and then there's 5 subtypes. So there's kind of like 10 types of winds in the body as they move. And wind here isn't, like I said, literal wind, it's more like an energy wind, what we call lung. And so there's like upward moving lung, there's downward moving lung, there's heart lung, there's our essence lung, and there's a lung that's pervasive throughout the body. And this helps, lung is responsible for our life force. So it helps us to see, it helps us to hear, it helps our digestive system to work. It helps us to speak, to think, to articulate. And yet when the lung is out of balance and it's not flowing correctly and fluidly, it can become stagnant, and it also can become sort of exacerbated in certain areas. So typically the lung disorder, you see in the modern world, if you go to a Tibetan doctor or you ask a Tibetan doctor, is ninglung, which is related to the heart, but also this upward moving lung being a little too excessive. So the upward moving lung, when it gets too excessive, we can have a lot of stress, anxiety, speediness, kind of stuckness in the head, either spaciness or kind of heaviness in the head, chest constriction, right? This can all be part of the lung being a little imbalanced in the upper body. And this is just typical. I would say most of us just experience some form of this nowadays. And not because there's anything wrong with us personally, it's just our society. I mean, just look at it. It's very speedy. And I mean, Santa Fe, I don't know. It's a little different here. So, the lung is a little down, but New York City, woof, this is like the the king of modern lung territory, in my opinion. But what's so tricky, just as the kleshas, just as the disturbing emotions or afflictive emotions, it kind of becomes part of our personality, right? So this is what I want to point out too. We might think, oh, I'm just the fast talker, or I'm just the, this kind of person or whatever. We don't realize everything is functioning interdependently and it's dependently arising. None of it is us. It's just sort of happening. And some of it is healthy and some of it is not healthy for a human life. So I kind of recognize that when, working with my speedy lung over the years and to settle it, it was almost like there was just certain aspects of my personality that changed dramatically. Some haven't, but some have. And what changed initially was, and this is more the point of why I'm saying it, is giving this whole talk on the lung, is that when we're experiencing an afflictive emotion, when the lung is high, when it's sort of high in the upper parts of the body, that afflictive emotion can feel like the whole world is ending. I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of afflictive emotion before, but sometimes when I would get a strong klesha, a strong emotion, it would just seem like everything is that, right? It just takes over and it becomes kind of really intense. And so what this is it's the speedy lung is kind of like the rocket fuel, because the lung doesn't have an afflictive emotion. The lung's just the lung, right? But if you can imagine, it's sort of the speedy rocket fuel pushing the rest of the experience. So if we're sad, we're going to be really sad. If we're angry, we're going to be quicker to anger, and the anger is going to be more intense. Same with craving. And so this is why sometimes just working with the breath and the energy winds, the breath is a tool to work with the energy winds, can be the first step. And this is why I do think for a lot of us in the modern world, just sitting with the breath as a meditation practice is so beneficial. And this is why so many people love it, I think. Yeah. But then, of course, we need to go this deeper layer of recognizing the klesha. And this is what, as you know, in more living lineage or traditional forms of Buddhism, we do. We learn what they are. We learn the descriptions. We learn to recognize them in our minds. And then we learn to apply antidotes like this. So this is going to be, I know this is very familiar to all you, but just giving a recap of that. So this part in the verse where it says, examine my mind, this is so important for lojong practice, and it's not, again, if we take it out of the good or bad or virtuous or non-virtuous or should or shouldn't model, we just see what we're working with here is curiosity of our minds, right? This is kind of what I was referring to before, but I was saying this element of like, sometimes we can examine in the way of looking for why we suck. like looking for where we're at fault. And the teachings even say it in that way. Sometimes they will. And so I'm not trying to create a dichotomy. The teachings are correct. It's just a shift in verbiage here for us sometimes, where it's instead of looking for, it's not the fault of who we are and fundamentally are, it's the fault of the klesha, right? So when we learn to make it not so personal, this has so much efficacy for us. So again, just sharing some things from my life that may or may not be relatable, but that part of examining, because I noticed for years I would examine, but I'm not examining. I am examining for the klesha or like experience in my experience in that moment, but I'm kind of like looking to find fault with myself, right? Which again goes back to that element of diminishment of sort of self-loathing or whatever. And so this is why the teachings on Buddha nature are so important to reflect on, because we first reflect on, I think I did mention this in the first talk, or at least I hope I did, we reflect on not our innate inadequacy, but our innate potential for awakening. And through that, we learn to see that at our root, we're okay. We're fundamentally okay. We're fundamentally, what's the word? Some would say fundamentally good, but I don't know. I don't like to use that dichotomy so much. We're okay. And from that, we just see we're okay. but there's lots of stuff that's coming up in our mind. There's lots of stuff that's coming up in our emotional content. That's not okay. That's creating suffering for ourselves. That also creates problems for others when we throw it onto them, right? And so then we kind of look to root that out as a process of love. I think this is what what I'm getting at is we look to root out our afflictive emotions because we love ourselves, not because we hate ourselves. Do you see that distinction? Yeah, it's a big one, and it's really, really subtle. So you have to look at your experience and look when you're examining your mind for the klesha, for the afflictive emotion, in sort of solidarity with this verse, and then you're applying an antidote. What is your feeling? Is your feeling one of love for yourself or one of disgust or frustration, right? So just encouraging that work. Good. So I think that's enough for that verse. So today, in this talk on finding strength in adversity, we have the next two verses, and probably we can add in verse 6 if we wanted. So we have verse 4, verse 5, maybe verse 6. So verse 4 reads, whenever I see a being of wicked nature who's overwhelmed by heavy non-virtue and suffering, I shall hold them dear as if I had discovered a precious treasure difficult to find. And then I'm just going to read verse 5 too. When out of jealousy others treat me badly with abuse, insult, and the like, I shall practice accepting defeat and offering the victory to others. So starting with this verse 4, which probably for most people is going to be, maybe for some people not relatable, but I think for most people they can hear some wisdom in this, right? Where when we see someone who we consider to be doing and acting in a way that's unskillful, destructive, maybe even harmful, what we start to do is to see them rather than just a wicked person, just a person who's harmful, just a person who is evil or full of hate or full of, whatever. We start to see what it says in the second part of the verse, who is overwhelmed by heavy non-virtue and suffering. And this is the shift from projection of our own making into compassion, right? So this verse is really talking about compassion, where for me, whenever there's a practice of compassion, there's an element of, okay, I'm going to have to deal with some uncomfort here, right? Compassion, we could even say, is it compassion if we're not facing some kind of uncomfort in the situation? I have that kind of open question. Loving kindness, for sure. Loving kindness doesn't have to be uncomfortable at all, actually. For some of us it is, but it doesn't have to be. Compassion, it sort of implies, because we define compassion as the wish for ourselves and others to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So when we're talking about suffering, we're talking about something that's uncomfortable. On whatever level of suffering that is. And whether we're meeting and seeing it in ourselves or meeting and seeing it in another, it has this element of discomfort, at least for me. So within that, when we're looking at someone, when we're analyzing our judgment of someone, our perspective where we might be limiting them, right? We are also starting to look at what this verse is pointing to, is looking at that possibly they are overwhelmed by a lot of suffering, by a lot of non-virtue. We were talking about the disturbing emotions, right? By a lot of afflictive or disturbing emotions. And so we start to, instead of demonizing this person, we start to have compassion for them. So I think this is pretty clear nowadays for people in the kind of spiritual departments or spiritual paths world, that compassion is not just like giving that person the benefit of a doubt to be an evil, destructive person, right? It's not just saying like, oh, I have compassion for him, therefore he can do whatever he wants, right? So I think just putting that out there in case it's not clear. It doesn't mean that. It means actually seeing that this person is deeply suffering due to their action, whether it's a beneficial action or not, or whatever's happening, that we're all struggling, we're all going through this thing called human life, which from a Buddhist perspective is part of the 6 realms of samsara. And therefore, you know, we have to experience suffering. It's part of the deal. It's what comes with it. And so we start to flip our idea that this person, and I'm thinking of a very specific person right now, probably one of the most polarizing persons in the world right now. And I don't mean to center the United States all the time, but a lot of people are looking at us, right? I think that's true. A lot of people around the world. So when I'm working with a person who has very little, strong destructive actions, divisive actions, actions diminishing some and lifting others up, and doing that either purposefully or unconsciously, through training the mind, I can start to see that person as actually like a really, really, really in trouble person, like deeply wounded and in trouble. A lot of the times for me, and I don't mean to diminish them through this, because I actually don't view children, as lesser than me, right? Just as a perspective. But I often think of this kind of person, if they're an adult, as sort of a child in an adult's body, meaning there's parts of them that haven't matured, and not just a child, but a very wounded child, a child that may have been abused, that may have been, you know, again, they have this, I think it's an AA saying, though I'm not an AA, where it says, hurt people, right? Hurt people, hurt people. And so we could see, like, if we take someone's history back, it's very rare to find someone that hurts people, and that's kind of what they primarily do in their life, where they haven't been harmed or hurt within their life. And I really like this because it helps me to start to see them as a precious treasure. So again, this later part of the verse is very interesting because it takes it a little further. And I think this is where the lojong comes in, where I do think a lot of atheists and agnostic and also, other religious traditions can work with this idea of seeing a wicked person or someone who's creating destruction and acting destructively, can see them as a wounded person and have compassion for them. But this is taking a step further, where it says, I shall hold them dear as if I discovered a precious treasure difficult to find. So why is that? And this is where the distinctive flavor of lojong starts to come in, right? And this is why I did all this prep work, because now what we're going to find in the verses moving forward is really what we need is a healthy base of contentment and self respect, essentially, right? Self-respect for ourselves and others, and other respect to go forward. Because what we're going to be doing now is not just we could talk about Trump here, but it really could be anyone. But it's someone personal in our life that we feel affronted, threatened, and basically dislike, right? That we feel threatened by, that we feel a sense of disgust, that we are being harmed in some way by this person. And so this is where the second part of the verse comes in. I shall hold them dear as if I discovered a precious treasure. So honestly, like when it comes to these, where we're moving in the lojong teachings now, it's not easy. I don't find it, how to put it, I like teaching it, but I don't find it the easiest thing to teach. And also I don't find it maybe the most useful thing to teach to everyone, depending on where they're at in their practice in life, for the reasons I think I've been very clear about. Because this can go really the wrong way, right? Where we're not diminishing ourselves in service of, treating this person like a precious treasure. What we have to start acknowledging at this point is, not only once we have some health, right? A little bit of, like I said, contentment with ourselves, appreciation for ourselves, a sense of okayness. Then what we can start to see is, well, even though I have a little more okayness, a little more contentment, maybe through working with my own psychology and body, healing some trauma, whatever we want to call it, even though I have a little bit of maturity, not me personally, but just saying we can have that maturity, I still am cherishing myself a lot. I'm still struggling with referencing the world to be about me, right? And the Dharma then recognizes that as an obstacle to awakening. Because if we're referencing the world around me, we're actually stuck in an illusion that the me is something independent, permanent, basically truly existent, right? Singular. And this really comes in verse 8, the verse talking about the nature of shunyata, or reality. But we can start discussing it now, because I think it doesn't, sure, it's wonderful to train in altruism, and I think that's great. And we can do this because we want to just be that beautiful bodhisattva to benefit all beings. But actually, a bodhisattva, what defines a bodhisattva is wisdom. What defines a bodhisattva is their realization of emptiness, not like whether they're Mother Teresa or not. You see what I'm saying? And this is a very tricky point, because we tend to get stuck in the relative, because that's what we are in right now. We are stuck in our relative appearances, in our perceptions, in our thoughts, in our whole description and idea of who we think we are, and who we think others are, and the world around us. And the whole Buddhist path is there to break that shell, because that shell is the root of suffering. That shell is constricting us, and is also constricting our service to others, like our fuller service to others. So I want to be clear, because I don't want to get too one-sided here. On a relative level, developing altruism, being a decent person in the world, I heard Glenn Danzig recently say, he said, he had this example. Do you all know who Glenn Danzig is? The singer from the Misfits and the group Danzig, like hard rock, punk, metal bands. I don't follow him that much, but I just heard this and I thought that's interesting. He said he kind of can see where a person is coming from and their decency in the world by if they put a shopping cart back once they've rolled it to their car. Like, and if they take it back to place it properly in a, whatever, where you put shopping carts. I thought, my first thought was like, oh shit, I think I've definitely like not put a shopping cart back many times. So I must be a total, worthless human being. But anyways, my second thought was, well, okay, take it with a grain of salt. But he had, he had a point where it's sort of like decency is sometimes around just very simple things like that, right? Like where we're doing things to be. He was actually talking about being a good citizen, like what a good citizen is, and some of it is just really simple things where you're looking out for others, and some of this is very obvious. But nonetheless, we do this as a training on a relative level too, as a Buddhist. So I don't want to just emphasize the ultimate side. On a relative side, being an altruistic person, having respect for people who do things like Mother Teresa feeding the poor and these kinds of things, or people doing activities that are beneficial to others and all that. That's wonderful. But what we start to describe in the Mahayana is that eventually has to connect into wisdom, the wisdom of emptiness. And so the whole point of doing the relative acts is in the service of others, but it's in the service of others because there's no separateness, right? It's not just to be this, it's not a Judeo-Christian good and bad argument. You see, the Buddha did use that a little bit, actually. When you look at the sutras, there is what do you call it? Like morality as a technique, meaning like for beings who aren't mature enough, you use morality as a reasoning. Okay, don't do this because you're going to suffer, right? Do this because you're going to benefit. But when we're talking about ultimate truth, actually, it's beyond benefit or harm, right? So again, sorry if this is getting too esoteric, and it'll get clearer when I go into verse 8. We'll focus on that specifically, but I just want to kind of throw this out there as a preliminary, because the Dharma is asking us to look a little bit deeper. It's asking us to think a little bit more detailed. It's asking us to reflect without looking for an immediate answer. I think the easy answer is just don't be an asshole, like, as much as possible, and like try to be a better person in the world. And that's part of the Buddha Dharma too. But then we have to look, but why are we doing that? Are we doing that just to be a good person, or is there something else? And again, I don't think it's an either or. It's not like, oh, well, then we do the ultimate side and forget being a good person. No, they come together. It's like, because we have this potential for awakening, because we have this quality of Buddha nature as our underlying nature, there's nothing to improve. Like, naturally compassion, some traditions will say naturally compassion and love arise out of that Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is not a cold nothingness. It's not a void. There is this fluidity and flow from it in our inner connection. Because if ultimately there's not a solid, independent me, mine, and I, how can there be an independent, solid me, other person and other phenomena? There can't. And so within that, the solidification of good and bad, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, actually break down, and then the fuller altruism can unfold, right? So in Buddhism, altruism is embedded in the teachings on emptiness and the teachings on wisdom. But anyways, I just wanted to say a little taste of that. Because it really relates to this, where we're going now in the verses. So I shall hold them dear as if I discovered a precious treasure, difficult to find. So now what we realize is not just the simple things, like, yes, I need to watch my afflictive emotions so I can be a better citizen in the world, so I can benefit people a little bit more. That's all good. There's perfect. I'm not debating that at all. Wonderful. And now there's an and here, not a but, an and. And what we're starting to realize is this self-cherishing really limits my service work. This idea of a solid, fixed sense of self really limits how I can be altruistic, right? Again, I think you see this again and again in the sort of, what do you call it? The worlds of kind of nonprofit worlds, the worlds of activism, things like that. People have really good intentions. And this is a very general statement, so I'm by no means blanketing everyone. But I see this with some of my friends, with people I know, with myself. We have very good intentions, and those intentions are beautiful, and that's part of an expression of our Buddha nature. Yet we squeeze it eventually. We squeeze the altruism, we squeeze the service work, we get stressed, and then some people burn out, right? So why is that burnout happening? Because the self-cherishing is still happening. We squeeze our idea of what we think is right or wrong. We squeeze our idea of how we need to fit into something or what we need to do to feel self-worth and value. But the Buddhist premise is you're already valuable. You're already worthy. There's no problem. Like, actually, this is very controversial, and I apologize if this offends anyone. Trump is already worthy. He's a worthy person because he has Buddha nature. That doesn't mean I agree with what he's doing. You know, he can be doing very bad, destructive things, but underneath that is a worthy person. And when we give someone that benefit of the doubt, we start to interact with them in a much different way, right? And in this text, it's still focusing on ourselves, to be clear. So when this aspect of the verse says, I shall hold them dear as if I discovered a precious treasure difficult to find, it's really talking about our mind and how we're interacting with someone. So when we treat someone as a treasure, someone who really disappointed us, someone who we struggle with, someone who we have aversion towards, we start to see our moments of constriction and self-cherishing in relation to that person. So like I already said, this doesn't mean we have to accept their destructive behavior. This doesn't mean we let their destructive behavior go unchecked either. A compassionate activity could be voting this guy out of office. That could be a compassionate activity, right? A compassionate activity could be, using. Now it's a little tricky when you look into a judicial system, whether it's just or not. But let's just do something simple like someone shoplifting. And there needs to be some consequence to that for some people in order to take that seriously, right? In order to rehabilitate from that. Let's just assume they'll be able to rehabilitate. So then, if we just say, oh, I'm being compassionate for this person and, there's no consequence here, it might be the opposite of compassion. Sometimes compassion is making the harder decision. And in the circumstance, it might be letting them go. I know when I was, 10 years old or something, I was stealing things and someone caught me and they let me go. They just told my mom. They didn't call the cops, and I have no idea what would happen if they called the cops. It could have changed the trajectory of my whole life, right? We can see this, playing out, even within the way America, like that also depends on my skin color. If I would have been black, I have no idea what would have happened, and that's, he might have not let me go. So anyways, I'm kind of going on tangents here, but the point is, we're seeing this difficult person, whatever this person says, wicked in nature. We're seeing them as a treasure, so we can work with our own minds, right? We can work with our own sense of how we're relating to our own suffering and happiness. So this kind of segues or flows right into verse 5. When out of jealousy others treat me badly with abuse, insult, and the like, I shall practice accepting defeat and offering the victory to others. So again, like if we're really on the bodhisattva train, if we really got the bodhisattva bite, as I call it, the Lama really hooked us through their compassion. Do you know what that means? I can describe what that means if that sounds like gibberish. Basically, what I'm saying is sometimes our karma really ripens when we meet Mahayana Buddhism or any kind of Dharma, and we can kind of be gung-ho about it, right? And then our Lama, we really love our teacher, and they can, the way they express these things can really, inspire us, right? So I know for me it was like that when I first encountered Lama Zopa Rinpoche. It still is, but it was like fired up. And so when I read this kind of verse, when out of jealousy others treat me badly with abuse, or I hear it being taught to me, I really want to take it on. And then, like I said, and gave warnings for, that was wonderful, and there's nothing wrong with that. We should take it on. But at the same time, we have to be aware of these other facets of, we're not diminishing ourselves through this. Because if we recognize our own mind in relation to how someone is treating us, we're now working with the self-cherishing mind, where fundamentally, at the center of all of it, we know we're worthy. So we're not becoming unworthy to then accept the defeat here. This is all this verse kind of around lojong, where it's accepting defeat. Like if we get into an argument with someone, and it's heating up and all of that, just taking the lower position, letting them win the argument, if that's going to be beneficial. We can see many bodhisattvas did not let people win the argument, right? So we have to be clear here. This is not to be used all the time. But for us, if we're using it to work with our self-cherishing mind, we use it like this, right? We use it to understand how is my pride interacting here? How is my sense of self interacting here? How is my aversion or craving, like craving to be right? I know, that's something I've struggled with. The craving, but if I just say more, I'm going to be more right. Right? We talked about this last week. I'm going to be more righter than I was the last time. More right, more righter. So accepting defeat is working with that. But again, this is nuanced. So just giving a little, you have to explore this for yourself. I don't have like here it is, and it's like my way to do this. But just as an example, I might work with this with recognizing when I'm becoming, the ego is excessively gaining ground in the situation, again, this is why the previous verse 3 is so important, because we have to have the ability to examine our mind. And then I might be examining my mind in that moment, if I'm able to, and see, oh yeah, I'm really just experiencing a lot of aversion. I really just don't like this person. And then I'll start working with these types of things. Okay, well, why, I may do a little analytical meditation with that if there's time in the moment, or just be with my aversion in the body, allow space for that. That's usually my first go-to. And then, just see, like, is this going to benefit my practice of understanding how I cling to self and how I experience a constricted sense of self by fighting this person? No, and then I can accept defeat. Now, if it's appropriate. Now, sometimes I may not, if I'm working with the self-cherishing, and there's a little bit of if we can have a mini shift and move into altruism. So again, that's why I said it really depends on the situation. These aren't generalizations for every situation. So just a little on verse 6, and then I'll open it up for some discussion. So this kind of, again, leads into really where this kind of practice is going. When someone I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall practice regarding him or her as my holy guru. So guru here is in the context of not just a physical person, but in the context of a teacher or a teaching, which can come from a lot of different directions. Our own mind sometimes, a physical teacher who we respect and actually relate to in that role as a spiritual teacher, a partner. Often our partners are our best gurus because they become a mirror for us. Could be wind, could be rain. Like these can all be the guru actually. And so so here we're treating that person who caused us harm or insulted us or whatever it was. We're practicing regarding them as a teacher in order to see that self-cherishing in action, in order to see the ego reification come up. And so that person gave us a chance to see what, Lama Zopa, when he teaches emptiness, usually he's talking about this gakcha, and to then this object to be refuted, right? So when our strong anger comes, we can see the object to be refuted more clearly because we can see what is the self experiencing that anger. Where does that exist autonomously or independently? Where does that exist inherently or truly within our five aggregates? And so if we have some skill in emptiness meditation, we might do some contemplation work there. And so due to that person's harm, they gave us an opportunity to actually see egolessness, to actually see emptiness, right? They gave us an opportunity to do that. And of course, on a relative level, it gives us an opportunity to strengthen our bodhicitta and our resolve. So I'm sure you've all have heard, I thought it was Rinpoche Rinpoche, but I recently heard the Dalai Lama talking about it as a different monk. But there was one monk he knew in Tibet and then was captured by the Chinese and tortured for a long time. And then eventually escaped. And he, where the Dalai Lama asked him, so what was your biggest suffering? Like, what was your biggest danger you experienced while being in prison, in Chinese prison, being tortured? He said, I almost lost my bodhicitta for the Chinese, soldiers. So this shows you this person was practicing lojong, and this is the relative level of aspirational bodhicitta, of this wish to attain awakening for the benefit of others. Where when we were working with uncomfortable or difficult circumstances, we get to strengthen our resolve for the Dharma, strengthen our resolve for knowing the nature of mind, for growing compassion, love, and bodhicitta. And again, sorry if I'm a broken record, this isn't done out of punishment for ourselves, right? That's really what I'm trying to emphasize here. We're not punishing ourselves here. It becomes a liberating act at that point, yeah? And actually, it does begin to point us to non-duality because it's playing a little bit with suffering and happiness. It's playing on a relative level with good and bad a little bit, right? And for a worldly person who doesn't want to know about emptiness, who doesn't care about ultimate truth, who just wants to stay with what they believe and project, this is not really a useful teaching, maybe a little bit, because it can give them a little more strength. But I don't know, maybe that's a strong statement. But I feel like this is really a useful teaching for someone who wants to wake up, for someone who really wants to understand how we're bound to and constricted in this kind of shell of ego clinging. So these are very serious teachings. That's why I said I like teaching them, but they can so easily be misconstrued. Yeah. Cool. So I think I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a lot, and we got about 25 minutes. So hopefully we can. I don't know if you're feeling talkative today, but hopefully we can just discuss. So in this, let's make it a little bit more interactive. So it doesn't have to. It can be a question. It can be something you're thinking about, and then we can play together on it. Yeah, something you're struggling with. Please, if you're struggling, don't feel shy. Like a Dharma teacher I really respect, who's an acquaintance and a peer, is Lama Rada Owens, who he just does a lot of interesting things, and he has an ethics contract that he sends everywhere he teaches. And one of the things on the ethics contract is in a either a private or a group teaching. You're welcome to challenge me. Like you're welcome to disagree, and I really like that because I feel like I just feel that anyways. Like that's something unwritten, but maybe I have to make it more explicit, that like it's okay to challenge, and you know, you're not going to go to hell, and you're not going to. Maybe you maybe sometimes may make me upset, but probably won't. You know, it'll be fine, because this is all up for our discussion, and you know, we're all just trying to become more beneficial people here. We're all just trying to understand what's going on with our lives. You know. So with that,
Scott, I challenge your assertion that Trump has value as a person.
yeah,
I'm kidding.
yeah,
I wanted to just maybe comment. You've said a lot, and I've been thinking about a lot of different things. But one thing that on verse 5, giving the victory to others, for
yeah.
me, kind of the higher the emotional content, the less likely I am to do that in the moment. And it often takes me sometimes days or weeks to be able to get to that place. But in the meantime, because of my anger, my acting from a place of kind of ego, maybe I've already done some damage, you know? And I mean, aside from purification practices, like what do we do to repair that in between, like flying off the handle and giving the victory to others? You know what I mean? Or do we need to? Is the process of giving the victory to others and doing that work, is that the meaningful part of that verse? Is that what, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, and really, yeah. Thanks. I like the complexity of what you're working with. I mean, there's a few things. First is like, yeah, it's like that for me sometimes too, where it's not immediate, right? It takes time, and that's where applying the antidotes help, because it's not like we just apply it once. We might have to apply it over weeks, like you said, and then we get to a point where, you know, one of my friends uses the example of a rubber band, and it's like two people are pulling on either side, but as we start to loosen our side and then eventually let go, they're really just holding on to a loose rubber. There's no
more tension.
Yeah, even though they may be holding it still, right? And then I think there's room for repair, and there's room to work with giving the victory over to them. Purification practices help when there's damage been done, but I actually think the lojong practice itself is purification. And so this is like where the idea of, because what is purification practice in Buddhism? What is merit practice? Purification is really just removing the obscurations that are in the way of experiencing our Buddha nature, right? And having that become the fruition of enlightenment. Maybe if we're taking more of a Sutrian approach, it's all the growth opportunities to what do you call it? Yeah, allow that Buddha nature to culminate in enlightenment. So I think the practice of applying the antidote with the right motivation, right, with a good intention of bodhicitta, the practice of working with that person in dialogue and constructive communication is all part of the purification.
Thanks.
But yeah, and I think it's more obvious too. Doing the repair with the person on just a personal level is useful too, right? Apologizing. I mean, one of the bodhisattva vows is around apologizing even if you're not at fault, if it's going to make the person's klesha lessen. So we're working like on a whole different level when we take on the training to become a bodhisattva. We're working on the level of it's not just about us. It's also about, in a situation, how we're the interdependence or the interplay is happening in relation to that person's samsara. So I think about this often because I like to argue. I used to like to argue. I don't like it that much anymore. And I realized, like, even though maybe I was okay with the debate or the argument, if I wasn't being skilled enough to recognize whether that person had the maturity to do it without getting super angry, it's actually a kind of a break of bodhisattva vows, because like what's the word? Poking and stoking their anger, instead of being kind to them and realizing, if I just shut up now, like, their anger will go down. Yeah. It's like, it's all of that. Any other reflections? Just anything?
Well, I don't want to hog the mic, but on
We got time. It's okay.
with verse 4, you had talked about, I don't know actually what triggered this thought in my mind, but it was encountering beings wicked in nature and looking at kind of what they're going through in terms of their own suffering and the causes of that. And I'm an attorney, so I love to argue. And it's kind
It's
of
your job.
my job to argue, right? But it's interesting as, you know, sexual abusers very often were sexually abused in childhood. And it's there's like this dichotomy in the criminal defense realm where like prosecutors see the sexual abuser as a sexual abuser, right? While trying to defend the young victim in a court case, whereas the criminal defense lawyer is more apt to see the sexual abuser as the former child who was sexually abused, whose rights are being advocated or protected in the court proceeding. So there's like this cause and effect that, depending on your view, totally shapes your perception of the present situation, you know, as either good or bad or good or evil. And it's interesting how just recognizing that everything comes from causes can kind of loosen your view in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of, we can see that's, you know, not everybody is structuring their view of the world around that. And I think we're seeing less and less ability to see cause and effect relationship. I was just thinking about this yesterday, actually, because just sort of as more division continues, it's sort of like, you know, yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, that's a really good point. And, you know, that's kind of what I meant earlier about the systems. It's really difficult. Like, what do we do where, you know, someone's not going to be rehabilitated in a system? They may be further, if they're a younger person, they may be further incentivized to do harm through the system, and or like taught how to do more harm, right? Not just consciously, but like unconsciously through being around people with even less, you know, ethical structure than them, right? They just learn how to be less ethical. Yeah, and in that case, I mean, that's a really good example, because often we would think, I think a sexual offender is thought of as kind of like a throwaway person in society. I had a mentee for a while who their partner was a sexual offender, and was, and it was found out, and I think they went to prison for a little while, then came back, or something happened. I don't remember if they were actually, there's litigation, but anyways, it was known to the community, and so this person is basically always that, and so they can't, even their family can't get out of the stain of that. And this, you know, we find many stories in the sutra like that too, not just around sex offenders, but around like where there's been a family or a person stained. You know, it often happened to, so like women, unfortunately, it was, you know, a lot of it was patriarchal. So it often happened to women who were, if they left their husband, and you know, a lot of them had to go into sex work or some kind of other ways to support themselves, because at that point they were just marked as, you know, lower than low. Because if a man didn't own you at that time in India, then you were nothing, you know. So we see it in different cultural systems and structures. And anyways, I'm kind of going off, but but what to do from our side? Because if we're involved in the system, I mean, this is where I really feel for like, you're working in law, you know, you've done for a long time, right? Your whole life, I'm assuming. It's really tricky, because but it's sort of like when we make it our path, that becomes not just like something we're doing where, okay, this is not good and it challenges me ethically and all that. We look, well, how do I work within that challenge as a Dharma practitioner? You know, I think that's where the value is. Because even like, it may seem like when you teach Dharma and that's your role, you know, that it's easy to be ethical and virtuous. No, there's a lot of tripwires and you know, things like that, especially around money and economy and Dharma teaching. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, thanks, man. Anything else? Anyone? Anything on your mind? Doesn't have to be anything profound. It can just be something you're thinking about. Something that kind of sparked for you in the teaching today.
Hi, Scott.
Hey.
Hey, so yeah, what sparked for me was going over the previous stuff of not taking that anger or klesha, whatever, into yourself.
Mm.
And, you know, and we had a little incident at my office, and I finally just lost it and said, this is how we have to do things. And then everybody got, you know, a little bit frustrated, and you know how it goes. So, you know, I've just been perseverating on that and thinking, why did I even say anything? This is how it should be done, but I'm not in charge and anymore. I used to be. And I'm trying to just go in and not ruffle feathers. But I just see things and I finally just have to say something. So I think I've been blaming myself. Even this morning, I couldn't even do my practice. I just had to go for a walk. So, you know, talking about this, not taking things on yourself, whether or not what I did was right or wrong, but then all of a sudden turning it into myself and just saying, you know, why couldn't I just shut up and let everybody be happy? That being said, what has happened is that things have changed, and this happened a couple of days ago. So that's changed, but it's just like, yeah, just thinking maybe I could have done it better or whatever. But learning not to take that on and then trying to apply that antidote. And I forgot that, even though we hear it all the time, and I totally have forgotten to do the antidote. I feel so much lighter now after listening to the talk and listening to other people's experiences. So that's what my practice is today. I'm going to start applying the antidote and just trying to settle into that and not take it aside. And some of that had to be said, but people weren't ready to hear it. And with this whole Corona thing, we have policies and things change on a daily basis. And it wasn't how it should be. And I know it wasn't. And nobody wanted to take responsibility. And even though I'm not in charge, but I've been there 20 years, and now my practice has turned over to someone else. And I finally just said, you've got to have communication. We've got to work together. There are 4 of us. And it's just, but anyway,
Yeah.
Now I feel a bit lighter, and I know not to take it on. It happened. Things have changed a little bit, and I need to just let it go. And I think this has helped me today to do that.
Wonderful. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I could tell it's still in your body. Yeah. There's a lot of charge.
Yes. It's in my, it's exactly right. And I've got to settle and ground and not let the lung do this or whatever. and yeah, so I've got to work with it today and a little bit more, you know. So I'm supposed to meet some friends for a hike, and I almost don't want to, but I will. And I don't know if I can work with it while I'm just out hiking too, you know.
Yeah, I mean, a few things. It's okay if I say a few things around it?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's not necessarily directed at your personal situation, but you know, anger. I wanted to say some things about anger, but before I say that, I'll just say something more practical, which is I find the first step, you know, because I've been teaching it here, so it's not foreign to you at this point. You've probably heard it before in other teachings. My first step is just going to the body, just basically what I've been talking about, just dropping in and allowing some time to feel that. For me, I don't know about you, but a lot of times around my anger is sadness. Like something didn't go the way I wanted, or I didn't get what I wanted. And, or the situation is frustrating. And so if I allow anger to be there, so again, this is tricky because this isn't in traditional Dharma. We wouldn't say like we allow anger, you know what I mean? In the Mahamudra teachings, they do. but it's sort of, you're not allowing, you're seeing the nature of the anger. So we use in Tantra Yana, we use the klesha to wake up. We used to wake up because we see it's, we drop the narrative and we see that, but we don't drop the energy. We use the energy, and then the energy of it can turn into what we call these 5 wisdoms. So anger has a certain wisdom that it's associated with that can develop out of the energy of it when we recognize the emptiness of that anger. But anyways, that's a totally different teaching, so I don't want to get into that. So I find the body, just allowing it to exist, is that first healthy piece of like where I don't turn it back on myself, because I'm not suppressing that. And then suppression to me is a little bit like, it is kind of turning it on myself. It's like I'm suppressing it and stuffing it in a box, and it just stays stagnant in my system, and what's the word? It percolates and, you know, stagnates, and eventually comes out in some really unskillful way. So so I always recommend that. And so what I do, kind of my sequence, which again, you have to see if this works for you all, but is like embodiment, meet the anger, meet the feeling, drop the story, just be with the sensation, right? If I can drop the story for the moment. And not to say stories aren't important, just right now we drop the story. And then I apply an antidote if I need to. Sometimes I don't need to. Sometimes that is the antidote, just doing that. And then the anger can, the energy of it can open, shift. Sometimes there's sadness underneath, and then I have to feel that, right? Whatever. So like that, yeah. And then if I can't do that in the real time with someone, then I apply just patience and love, you know, if it's anger to the situation. And then, but it's tricky because I don't think Shravakyana styles of applying an antidote is suppression, but it can easily do that if we're not careful.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
Good. And the other thing I want to talk about is anger, which maybe I'm just flagging it because if anybody wants to talk about it more, I don't want to launch into a whole teaching on it. But anger, I think, you know, we're in these times where like anger is demonized by Buddhism, but actually the energy of anger, the sort of intensity and passion can be quite useful. Because yeah, you didn't go into it, nor do we need to, but you know, we could be talking about a situation that is actually useful for you, you know, to voice up about, right? To voice yourself, to be heard. And it's just then how do we do that skillfully? I think that's always the question in Buddhism. And I think a lot of people mistake Buddhism for niceness. And then that gets blended with white dominant culture, which also has an element of like, we need to be nice all the time. Like, and sometimes I have a real strong bullshit meter. And again, this is probably mostly my judgment, but a bullshit meter, when someone's smiling at me, but I feel like resistance inside, I immediately, my alarm bells are like, don't trust, you know? And this is an element of kind of our culture now, because I'll give you an example. And again, I don't mean to always go into these kind of issues that are up, but I think it's important to use them as examples. I've lived in Black neighborhoods now for a couple years, probably the most I've lived in my life in a primarily Black neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I've gotten to see just how we acculturate and use our voices and bodies so differently sometimes in racialized society. And so what maybe would have struck me as like more aggressive, like being loud and aggressive and things like that, and maybe not nice, now don't anymore in certain circumstances. I mean, sometimes they do, but I don't take, like, if there's, for instance, a group of Black teenagers being really loud and singing rap lyrics or whatever, not to say a cliche, just walking down my street, that's what can happen. They're coming home from school, and you know, I don't take that as aggressive. That's them expressing themselves from their culture. Like, and it's not, so my version of nice doesn't have to look like their version, you know? So it's just an element just to describe sometimes when we're working with niceness in Buddhism, is I think when I go to India or Tibet, actually, like, niceness is also not the same as we interpret it here in the dominant culture in the United States. And so Buddhism can sometimes be seen through this lens of like, oh, then that means kindness means niceness all the time. Not necessarily. I think it's all coming from the root of our being. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? So if I'm smiling out of genuine love for you, wonderful. If I just want to be like this out of genuine love for you, it's also okay. I don't see the problem with that. You know? So anyways, kind of a tangent, but I think anger is a big one that has to be talked about. Lama Radowan's another guy, if you want to, you know, this teacher I recommended, if you want to go into his work he's a queer black man who grew up in Georgia, who is a well-known teacher now. He just wrote a book called Love and Rage that's quite good, and it talks about rage from his experience growing up black in America and queer, but also rage just as in Buddhism and spirituality and how we view anger. It's quite a detailed, nuanced discussion of it. I really like it. I think it's important to start talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, one more thing. Just to put a caveat to make it clear, I think it's important to start talking about, because like, I'm assuming you present as a woman-bodied person, yes? So because like women's voices have been diminished deliberately, like, and so this is the trick of it, is like, then do we stay quiet or do we say something? And when are we saying something out of ego reification? And when are we saying it out of just being an equal voice in the room? You know, so I just want to point that out, that this is important.
Hi, Scott.
I just got a bunch of man points there. I didn't do it for that. I'm joking. My
Oh.
No, you see all the women smile, but I really mean it. I do mean it.
Yeah, just to continue on the anger thing, what I noticed the first time I started really applying this specifically, meditating on the anger and just letting it arise. It's following, you know, probably a session with you. It was something between me and my son, and I felt okay. I just allowed myself just to, during a meditation, to just feel the anger, express it fully, no matter how irrational I thought a lot of it was on my part. You know, just allow it, and it really worked, and it paved the way to meditating on my love for him. But then there are times, and this is really my point, I find there are many times where I, you know, allowing the anger, allowing just to give it full expression during meditation, during practice, it really works the way it's supposed to work. And then I find that there are times where, and this is usually with more like what Nancy was saying, with people who I'm not, you know, not like my son, not somebody I'm not close with, where meditating or practicing or thinking about the anger just kind of fuels the fire and just makes me more angry, you know.
Yeah.
And so there must be a difference in the way I'm doing it, or something, or in the spirit of it, or something. There's some difference, you know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good thing to be noticing. And then what I would encourage is just continued curiosity and exploration of that. Like, why in one way something shifted and opened, and there was like a mini liberation, right, of the anger. And then in another way, it kind of exacerbated it. So we have to look. Of course, like, we could speak of it intellectually, where it's like, when the ego reification is happening more and more around the anger, that's definitely going to constrict it, and it's going to continue. But it's just like, because now you're talking more on a felt level, so that's why I don't want to use so much intellect around it or conceptual ideas, because you just have to feel that out and see, and you know, thanks for sharing this, Dan, because there's one thing I forgot to say earlier around Adam and Nancy's sharing, which is I think we have to leave room in our Dharma practice for also like mistakes, you know, because I think that's really how we learn, because it's like this process of, like you're saying, Dan, it's like sometimes you notice it liberates, sometimes it doesn't. So then we notice, oh, what's happening, and it's actually not a mistake. I think we're just learning what is helping us to open up the reified eye, and what's kind of closing it and what we call doubling down on the reified eye. There's a wonderful quote I like by Khenpo Socham Gyamtso Rinpoche, who says, mistake after mistake, I travel the unmistaken path. So that's something I really, really like to remind myself of. Not as a way to like give myself permission to be a shitty person, but again, it takes off the load that we have to be perfect. So you weren't saying that, Dan. I just wanted to say, I think continuing that non-perfection, as well as curiosity about our minds and our emotions.
Yeah.
But definitely, I mean, conceptually, it's around how we're reifying, right?
Yeah. So I've used this. I know this isn't the spirit you said it in, but I've used that quote numerous times when talking to my kids, specifically to my son and daughter. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Just to defend your mistake.
Right.
No, I'm joking.
It's not the first time for sure, as you know. Definitely not gonna be the last time, so don't get your hopes up.
Yeah, totally. Cool, good stuff. Yeah, I'd say just keep working with it, and maybe work a little, do a little bit more investigation, internal inquiry into the narrative, how you're relating to the narrative. So that's like I want to give you a little clue, but not too much clue. I'm taking my girlfriend for a birthday somewhere special next week, and I gave her too much clue, and she figured it out. So I'm trying to be better with just a little clue, not too much clue. Anywho, we're at 12:30, and yeah, unless there's anything else, maybe we can dedicate the merit. Yeah, Nancy.
I just want to leave us on a light note when you were talking about living in the Black neighborhood and getting used to the culture. I have a friend that I was speaking to yesterday who lives here in Los Alamos, and she had made a sign for her yard, Black Lives Matter, and the Black in the lives had enough space, and she had seen other signs where they put hearts or flowers, and she thought, oh, I think I'm going to put a peace sign right there. So she drew a peace sign. Then she put the sign in her yard. And later on, she was pulling out of her driveway and looked at the sign and realized the peace part of the sign wasn't as visible. So what the sign looked like, it said was, Black olives matter. So she had to change that really quick.
That's great.
So,
That's awesome. I also think black olives matter too. Yeah.
I do too.
And green ones. Yeah, I like green ones. But yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we need to find some joy and laughter in this too. In these situations we're in. I wrote something for Tricycle Mag called "Joy is a Radical Act" a while back. I just saw they reposted it. Again, Lama Owens talks a lot about this in the queer BIPOC communities around like finding joy in activism and sort of also like, because if we're, I think it's part of the issue we're in right now is like everyone's experiencing like pain on top of pain on top of pain with inability to recognize the sparks in life and the interconnection and the joy and the laughter. So thank you. That's great. Perfect.
Hi, Scott.
Yeah, hey.
Hey, this is Elena. I just want to say thank you.
Sure.
I really enjoyed very, very, very much. I'm not a Buddhist. I have another spiritual path, but it's very similar with everything. And the only reason that I don't do both is because I don't have enough time for both of them.
Very smart person. Yeah.
Yeah, just concentrated on one. But thank you very much. We are not going to be here next week.
Okay.
But I think we have a way to see it later.
See, yeah, we have the recording on the YouTube. Yeah.
Thank
Cool.
you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining. Yeah, have a good time next weekend.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll do some dedications and then we'll close. Yeah, Mary's just got to pull them up. And thank you for sitting through all of this, even though it's not your kind of spiritual tradition. But we can see there's so much relationship. Yeah. Lojong, actually, I think you could practice any tradition you don't have to be Buddhist to practice. It's very beautiful. Oh, it's a different thing. Okay. So we'll just recite in English. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta may the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Okay, thanks everyone so much. Thanks, Mary. We got our last one.
Thank you so much, Scott.